I will be presenting on the construction of space and time through sound in Paradise Lost. This is in conjunction with my honors thesis in English, mentored by Dr. Spencer Wall. So, kind of the idea is a lot of Milton criticism historically separates the sound of the poem of Paradise Lost and Milton's poetry in general from the sense, so that what is actually being said. And they a lot of the argument is that there's two ways to read Milton's poetry. There's the way to read it aloud and kind of get involved with just the poetic language, or to read it and actually figure out what it's saying. T.S. Eliot, who's kind of a famous, I guess, anti-Miltonist, as he's been described, said that the inner meaning is separated from the surface. And even in more recently, there's been people who write extensively on kind of the sound and the music of Milton's poetry, Paradise Lost and otherwise, but they mostly focus on the syntax and kind of don't pay as much attention to the poetic language and the rhythm and the alliteration and assonance and consonants and those kind of poetic ideas. Conversely, there's others who do focus on the rhythm and sound and kind of do the detailed scansion, but to some extent ignore more the grammar and actual meaning. So what I want to propose is kind of return to what Christopher Ricks wrote about as Milton's grand style, where the sound and sense, while they don't always necessarily line up, there are definitely passages where Milton is more grandiose than kind of necessary, but in many cases they do combine, in that his grandeur and his subtlety often coexist in the very same lines. I'm kind of going to take this view and apply it to how Milton's poetry, and Paradise Lost specifically, constructs literal space, as in like how characters and objects are physically placed within the universe, as well as more metaphysical and maybe psychological space of how characters think of themselves within kind of the cosmology created by Milton as part of his monist philosophy. And so for this presentation, my goal is to just read a few passages, kind of give the context, and just read them aloud so you can get a sense of the sound. And then I'll provide a brief analysis of just some of the key ideas that maybe kind of I think might lend to this kind of combination of the sound and the sense. First, I'm going to describe kind of Satan's position in hell and how he perceives it and how Pandemonium is constructed. Next, I'm going to discuss God's position in heaven and how his speech relates to the Miltonic universe. And then I'm going to discuss Adam and Eve in Eden and how their morning hymn places themselves within the universe. And then finally, I'm going to just kind of give a brief overview of the creation scene from Book 7 and just describe how this scene really presents sound as almost the very single fundamental universe that holds the entire everything together. All of creation is kind of at its very core related to sound. First, this first passage is probably one of the most famous from the poem, and it comes from Satan's speech where he's attempting to just mentally justify his newfound position within hell. He says, "A mind not to be changed by place or time. The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven." Now, a lot of what I argue with Satan is that he's saying one thing, but kind of the language itself and the sound is saying the opposite. So in this case, he is trying to distance himself from heaven, kind of set himself up as an individual within hell, that he can just mentally make it anything that he desires. But if we look in that last line, we have a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. And in this kind of anti-metabolic structure, even though he's trying to separate the two, we still have hell is encased in heaven, so that even when Satan tries to distance himself from God and his universe, he's still entrapping himself within it. This next passage comes from the construction of Pandemonium, which is the golden palace where the demons convene to plan and argue. And It's described in this way. As in an organ from one blast of wind, to many a row of pipes the soundboard breathes, anon out of the earth a fabric huge rose like an exhalation, with a sound of dulcet symphonies and voices sweet, built like a temple where pilasters round were set, and Doric pillars overlaid with golden architrave. One of the lines I want to focus on in this passage, we have the sound of dulcet symphonies and voices sweet, which at first read sounds almost heavenly, of kind of the beauty of this construction. But if we really listen to it, we have this repeated S sound, this sound of dulcet symphonies and voices sweet, which in some sense underlies it with a sinister overtone, kind of foreshadowing the temptation of Satan's temptation in the guise of a snake, and the eventual transformation of the demons into serpents in Book 10. That even when they're trying to create something in, that appears beauty, and it does appear beautiful, but there's kind of a malevolent aura to it all the same. This next passage is describing God right before he gives his first speech, and he's looking down on Satan. And it says, "Him God beholding from his prospect high, wherein past, present, future he beholds." I think this passage really gets to the heart of the combination of space and time within kind of God's omnipresence. That past and present and future he's able to behold them, so he's able to not only see them, but there's this other sense of behold where he's literally, like, the time itself becomes a physical object that God can grasp. But he's also beholding him, which in this case is that him is referring to Satan. And so there's also an element of that omnipresence, that even in Satan, who is traveling through chaos from hell, there's still an element of God. He's kind of, as the word omnipresence suggests, he is everywhere, even in Milton's universe, even where we might not expect him. This next passage comes from the middle of his speech, where he's describing what he knows that the eventual fall of Adam and Eve, and is arguing that even if he knows that they will fall, it's still a free choice that they have. "So will fall he and his faithless progeny. Whose fault? Whose but his own? Ingrate, he had of me all he could have. I made him just and right, sufficient to have stood, though free to fall. Such I created all the ethereal powers, and spirits, whom both them who stood and them who failed. Freely they stood who stood, and fell who fell." So we really get this contrast between standing and falling, this kind of upright and upward pointing stature versus this downward tending one. And in the fall, we have that kind of descending of the lines from will fall to fall to fell. So we have this future is becoming the past, that they're, in God's eyes, they're all the same, and that it's predetermined, but as if it already occurred. But he's still arguing that it's free, and we get that sense with kind of the repetition of the fall and fell sound in the word fault and failed, that this isn't necessarily something predetermined, but it is a moral failure of Adam and Eve. And the alliteration with the word free, which is also compared with standing and falling, kind of really enforces that idea. Next, we see Adam and Eve in Eden, and they wake up and kind of give an impromptu prayer called the morning hymn. And this first passage is describing kind of how it sounds. "Lowly they bowed adoring, and began their orisons, each morning duly paid in various style, for neither various style nor holy rapture wanted they to praise their Maker. In fit strains pronounced or sung, unmediated, such prompt eloquence flowed from their lips, in prose or numerous verse, more tunable than needed lute or harp, to add more sweetness, and they thus began." So this passage is describing their prayer, that it's free form, that it's unmediated, so it's not bound by rigid structures of poetry or of rhythm. And we get that sense through the line that all this enjambment, meaning the line continues on or the sentence continues on past the line break, where it kind of loses its structure in some way and mimics how Adam and Eve are professing their adoration. The second passage comes from the middle or towards the end of their prayer, where they're calling on the other objects of creation to offer their praise with them. This one is referring to the water specifically. Fountains in ye that warble as ye flow, melodious murmurs warbling tune his praise. So even this short passage, we get that repetition with warble and warbling. We get the alliteration and melodious murmurs. And so we have this sense of the kind of flowing waters that flows like their, the way the structure of their prayer, that it is meandering, but it's all directed toward some kind of greater purpose. And that greater purpose, in some sense, is just the act of creation. And so in this creation scene of Book 7, which is being told by the Archangel Raphael to Adam, or in a sense recounted, since Adam experienced at least part of it, this first passage is given when the Son descends, so Son as in S-O-N, as in the Father and the Son, and is telling the world to be silent before the creation can begin. Silence, ye troubled waves, and thou deep peace, said then the omnific word, your discord end. The word omnific is a neologism, and so in it we have all creating, but we also have that root fic, which relates to fiction. So in some sense, poetry itself and the written and spoken word is involved in this act of creation. One important biographical detail to note is that Milton, when he was writing Paradise Lost, was blind, and so he had to dictate the entire poem to a scribe who would write it down for him. And so there's this idea that in order to create, first you need silence, that there is sound, and it's discord and it's chaotic, and it it's kind of the opposite of constructive. And so in order to create from that, you first need silence, so then you can morph the sound into space and time. This next passage is after the creation scene, and it's when the Son, again S-O-N, is reascending back to heaven, kind of celebrated for his creative acts. Up he rode, followed with acclamation and the sound symphonious of 10,000 harps that tuned angelic harmonies. The earth, the air resounded, thou rememberest, for thou heardst. The heavens and all the constellations rung, the planets in their station listening stood, while the bright pomp ascended jubilant. There's a lot going on in this line, but the one word I want to focus on is resounded. And in some sense, the word itself kind of resounds, just the sound of it. But we also, if we break it up into its parts, we have re-sound, as if the sound is coming again. And this is a retelling of the creation, so the noise of the creation is kind of being retold, and the sound is being reformed to tell it, both within the story, as in Raphael telling it to Adam, but also within the reader, and Milton telling it to the scribe, and the reader kind of re-listening or rereading it. The assumed reader would, of Milton's assumed reader would, of course, be familiar with the biblical creation story, and so it's just reappearing here. And that's enforced by the thou rememberest, for thou heardst. That's Raphael telling Adam, but it's also kind of the poem telling the reader that you remember this story, you've heard this story. This story is kind of, sound is the fundamental repeating structure, not just of the story, but of all creative acts. And that kind of within this Miltonic universe, we have that one central element of sound that is at the core of everything that is done. And I think that's kind of just the main draw I want to get from this research and from my thesis, is that Milton's poetry, while it's easy to kind of look at some of the passages and say, oh, it's hard to understand the sense of it just from the sound, but I think there's really kind of a fundamental structure of that sound being important to the creation of the poem, as well as within the poem to the universe inside. Thank you for watching.